The fluorescent lights of the Sunset Ridge Community Clubhouse hummed with a flat, indifferent buzz, a sound Arthur Evans had come to associate with institutional apathy. He stood at the flimsy lectern, the laminated wood cool beneath his fingertips. Before him, seated at a long folding table draped in a polyester tablecloth, was the Architectural Control Committee, a tribunal of 3 neighbors who, for 2 hours, every first Tuesday of the month, held dominion over the color of mailboxes and the height of hedges. Presiding from the center was Carol Peterson, president of the Homeowners Association. Her posture was impeccable, her blonde bob haircut a marvel of geometric precision. She listened to Arthur's calm explanation with an expression of strained patience, her pen tapping a rhythmic, metronomic beat against a stack of papers. And so, as the original county survey from 1978 clearly shows, Arthur concluded, gesturing to the enlarged plat map he'd propped on an easel. The irrigation shed in question is not only situated a full 10 feet inside my property line, but it was also constructed 40 years before the Sunset Ridge development. And by extension, this association even existed. It predates the very covenants, conditions, and restrictions you're attempting to enforce. He had presented his case with the methodical clarity he'd honed over 30 years as a forensic accountant and insurance fraud investigator, facts, documentation, and a linear timeline. It was a formula that had unraveled multi-million-dollar scams and put con artists behind bars. Here, in this beige-walled multi-purpose room that smelled faintly of stale coffee and cleaning solution, it was met with a placid stare. Carol Peterson stopped tapping her pen. She offered a smile that did not touch her eyes, a practiced arrangement of facial muscles designed to convey authority, not warmth. Thank you for your historical perspective, Mr. Evans. It's always fascinating to learn about the area's agricultural past. A few nervous titters rippled through the small audience of a dozen or so homeowners. Arthur felt a familiar tightening in his chest. It was the preamble to dismissal, the polite condescension that preceded the bureaucratic hammer. However, Carol continued, her voice crisp and amplified slightly by the room's poor acoustics. The board's decision is based on the community's governing documents as they exist today. Section 8.4.2 of the CC&Rs is quite clear regarding the maintenance of designated view corridors, unapproved structures, regardless of their age, that impede these corridors are in violation. But the corridor you're referencing, Arthur countered, keeping his tone even, is an interpretation of a vaguely worded easement. It isn't explicitly defined on any recorded plat. The shed is on my private property, not the common area. Your interpretation is noted, Carol said, her smile tightening. She glanced at the other 2 committee members, who immediately straightened in their chairs, their expressions carefully neutral. The committee has reviewed the complaint filed by a neighboring homeowner and conducted a site visit. The violation, as cited in the courtesy notice you received on October 1st, stands. You have 14 days to bring the property into compliance. Next on the agenda, the Hendersons' request for a non-standard satellite dish. She picked up her pen and made a neat checkmark on her agenda. The public humiliation complete. Arthur's evidence, his logic, his history, all of it was irrelevant. He was being overruled not by reason, but by sheer, immovable will. As he packed up his plat map, the quiet rustling of his papers sounded like a roar of defeat in the suddenly silent room. He hadn't just lost an argument about a dilapidated tin shed. He had been issued a challenge. And he knew, with the cold certainty of a seasoned investigator, that this was not about the view. It was about something else entirely. The 15-acre ranch was more than land. It was a trust. Arthur's grandfather, a man whose hands were calloused from a lifetime of work and whose words were as sparse and solid as the granite outcrops in the north pasture, had made him promise. "Don't let them chip away at this place." "Artie," he'd said from his hospital bed, his voice a dry rasp, "not an inch." Now, standing on his back porch with a mug of coffee, Arthur watched the early morning sun burn the mist off the fields. The land, a holdout of old Texas grassland, was bordered on three sides by the manicured sameness of Sunset Ridge. Rows of beige and taupe houses with identical landscaping stood in stark contrast to his rolling pasture and the weathered gray wood of his family's original barn. He had retired here, seeking peace. A quiet epilogue to a career spent navigating the labyrinthine deceptions of others. Instead, he'd found the front line of a new, petty war. His wife, Eleanor, joined him on the porch, wrapping a cardigan around her shoulders. She was a retired librarian, a woman whose calm demeanor was a perfect counterbalance to his analytical intensity. "How did it go?" she asked, though his posture had already told her the answer. "It went as expected," Arthur said, taking a sip of coffee. "They're not interested in facts. This is about establishing dominance." "It's just an old shed." "Arthur," she said gently, her voice a familiar comfort, "it's falling apart anyway. Would it really be so terrible to tear it down? Is it worth all this?" It was a reasonable question, the one any sane person would ask. But Arthur's entire career had been built on the principle that small, unchallenged falsehoods grow into catastrophic ones. You don't ignore a forged signature on a minor claim, because next time it will be on a life insurance policy. You don't let a vague clause in a contract go unexamined, because one day it will be used as a weapon. It's not about the shed, Ellie. It's about the 20 feet of land they're trying to control with this view corridor nonsense. He walked inside to his study, Eleanor following. The room was organized with a precision that bordered on obsessive financial records in labeled binders, research texts arranged by subject, a large county map tacked to a corkboard. This was his sanctuary, the place where chaos was ordered into submission. He spread his own property survey, a crisp document from a recent refinancing, on his large oak desk. The lines were clear, the boundaries marked by iron rods set in concrete. Then he laid the packet from the HOA next to it. It contained a copy of the CC&Rs and a crudely drawn map where a dotted line sliced across his property, labeled Designated View Corridor Easement. "Their map is an invention," he said, tapping the drawing. "It doesn't correspond to any official record." He found the copy of the polite, carefully worded email he'd sent to the management company a week ago, after receiving the initial courtesy notice. To Sunset Ridge Management, from Arthur Evans. 1414, Old Mill Road subject. Ref, courtesy notice. Unapproved structure. Dear Management, I am writing in response to the notice dated October 1st regarding the irrigation shed on my property. For your records, I have attached a copy of my official property survey. As you can see, the structure is well within my property lines. Furthermore, this shed was built circa 1980, long before the establishment of the Sunset Ridge HOA. I trust this documentation clarifies the matter. Please update your records to reflect that no violation exists. Sincerely, Arthur Evans. The reply had come not from the anonymous management company email, but from Carol Peterson herself. It was brief and chillingly dismissive. Mr. Evans, the ACC has received your email. The matter will be addressed at the hearing on the 7th. Your attendance is recommended. Carol Peterson, President. Sunset Ridge HOA. No acknowledgement of his evidence. No room for discussion. It was the digital equivalent of a stone wall. Back on his desk, he picked up the thick, professionally bound CC&Rs he'd been given when the development first broke ground. He thumbed through the pages until he found the section cited in the notice. He'd highlighted it a week ago. 8.4.2 Maintenance of View Corridors. All lots subject to a designated view corridor easement, as defined on the association's community map, shall be maintained by the lot owner in such a manner as to preserve the scenic vistas for the benefit of the community. No structure, vegetation, or other obstruction may be erected or permitted to remain within the easement area without prior written approval from the Architectural Control Committee. He read the words again, and a cold knot formed in his stomach. The phrase as defined on the association's community map was the key. It was a circular reference, a self-validating loop. They could draw any line they wanted on their unofficial map and claim it was gospel. He muttered to himself, the way he often did when dissecting a fraudulent document. This is dangerously vague. It was designed to be. It was a blank check for overreach, a tool of power disguised as a rule. His grandfather's words echoed in his mind. Don't let them chip away at this place. The chipping had begun. The mail carrier's truck was a familiar sight, a welcome interruption in the rural quiet. But on the afternoon of October 9th, it brought something different. Arthur saw the small green card tucked into his mailbox alongside the usual catalogs and bills. Certified mail. He'd sent and received thousands of them in his career. They were never good news. They were the official start of something unpleasant. He signed the carrier's electronic pad and took the crisp, business-sized envelope. The return address was not the HOA itself, but a law firm in the city Patterson, Dunn and Associates, legal counsel for Sunset Ridge. HOA, using a law firm for a simple violation notice, was a deliberate escalation, a show of force meant to intimidate. Inside his study, he slit the envelope open with a letter opener. The paper was thick, creamy, and expensive. The language was formal, dense with legal jargon. It was a formal violation notice. Renotice of violation and demand for compliance property. 1414 Old Mill Road, Millfield County. TX violation, CC&Rs, RUR 8.4.2, obstruction of designated view corridor. Dear Mr. Evans, this correspondence serves as a formal notice of a continuing violation of the covenants, conditions, and restrictions, CC&Rs, for the Sunset Ridge community. As per the Architectural Control Committee ACC hearing on October 7, 2023, the unapproved structure and irrigation shed and overgrown vegetation located within the designated view corridor easement on your property have been found to be in non-compliance. A photograph of the violation, taken October 8, 2023, is enclosed for your reference. Pursuant to the authority granted to the association in the governing documents, you are hereby required to cure this violation within 14 days from the date of this notice. Compliance requires the complete removal of the unapproved structure and the trimming of all vegetation within the easement area to a height not to exceed 3 feet. Failure to comply by October 23, 2023, will result in the levying of fines in the amount of $100, $100 plus an additional $25.25 per day. For each day the violation continues, the association reserves the right to pursue all available remedies, including, but not limited to, entering the property to cure the violation at your expense, and placing a lien against your property for all outstanding fines and costs. The letter was signed by a partner at the law firm. Stapled to it was a grainy, time-stamped color photograph of his shed, taken from a neighbor's upstairs window. The angle was deliberately chosen to make the small structure look like a monolithic obstruction against the distant hills. It was a piece of carefully manufactured evidence. This was no longer a suggestion or a neighborly dispute. It was a formal threat with a deadline, financial penalties, and the specter of a lien that could cloud the title to his family's land. The polite phase was over. They had codified their fiction into a legal demand. Arthur sat back in his chair, the heavy paper resting in his hands. He felt no panic, no rage. Instead, a deep, cold calm settled over him. It was the feeling he got when a complex fraud case finally revealed its structure. The perpetrators had made their move, laid out their strategy on the table. They believed their process, their lawyers, and their carefully worded documents made them invincible. They had mistaken his desire for peace as a weakness. It was a common miscalculation, and one he had built a career on exploiting. He picked up the phone and dialed a number from memory. "George Riley, please." The hearing was a masterclass in procedural theater. It took place not in the informal clubhouse, but in a rented conference room at a sterile office park, a neutral ground that felt anything but. The air was thick with a tense, artificial formality. Arthur arrived 15 minutes early, armed with a briefcase containing his surveyor's maps, county records, and a notarized copy of his grandfather's original deed. The HOA board sat at a polished mahogany table at the front of the room, looking more like a corporate panel than a group of volunteer neighbors. Carol Peterson was at the center, flanked by the association's treasurer, a nervous-looking man named Frank Miller, and the secretary, a representative from the management company. A young woman with a laptop sat silently to the side, taking minutes. When his name was called, Arthur approached the table. He was given a single chair, positioned several feet away from the board, creating a clear sense of petitioner versus authority. "Mr. Evans," Carol began, her voice devoid of any warmth, "you have requested this hearing to appeal the violation notice dated October 8th. The board has reviewed the file. You may present your case." Arthur methodically laid out his evidence. He started with the original 1978 county plat map, pointing to the clearly marked property lines. "As you can see," he explained, "the area in question has always been part of the Evans property. There is no mention of a view corridor easement on this official, recorded document." He then presented the original deed. Again, the legal description of the property is unambiguous. The only easement recorded against this parcel is a standard utility easement along the southern border, nowhere near the shed. He concluded with his own modern survey. This confirms the findings of the original documents. 3 separate land records, spanning 50 years, are in perfect agreement. The association's claim is based on an unrecorded, internally created map with no legal standing. He had built an unassailable case on a foundation of legal fact. He looked at the board members, expecting at least a flicker of consideration. He saw nothing. Frank Miller, the treasurer, fidgeted with his pen, refusing to make eye contact. The secretary stared blankly at a spot on the wall behind Arthur's head. Carol let the silence hang in the air for a moment before speaking. "Thank you, Mr. Evans. We appreciate you sharing those historical documents." She slid a piece of paper across the table. It was the HOA's crude community map. "This is the official map of the Sunset Ridge community, as adopted by the board in 2021 and provided to all homeowners. It clearly delineates the view corridor, the CC&Rs, which you agreed to when this development bordered your property. Grant the board the authority to establish and enforce such community standards." "An adopted map doesn't supersede a recorded deed or a county plat," Arthur countered, his voice rising slightly despite his efforts. "You can't just draw a line on a piece of paper and claim a portion of my property. That's not how property law works." "We are not claiming your property, Mr. Evans. Carol said, her tone sharp with condescension. "We are enforcing a reasonable covenant to preserve property values for the entire community, a benefit from which you, as an adjacent landowner, also derive." She turned to the other board members. "Does the board have any questions for Mr. Evans?" Silence. "Very well. The board will now deliberate. You will be notified of our decision in writing within 10 business days." The dismissal was swift and absolute. The entire hearing had been a sham, a box to be checked in the due process chain. His evidence was irrelevant because the verdict had been decided long before he'd walked into the room. As he packed his briefcase, the weight of the situation settled upon him. This wasn't about a shed, or a view, or even property values. This was a targeted, systematic campaign to force him into submission. And he was beginning to suspect that Carol Peterson wasn't acting alone. The official denial arrived 5 days later, a cold, 2-sentence letter confirming the violation and the impending fines. It was the starting gun for Arthur's investigation. He shifted from homeowner to investigator. The familiar hunt for truth, a welcome antidote to the frustration of the kangaroo court. His first move was a formal, written request, citing the Texas Property Code, for the HOA's complete financial records for the past 3 years' budgets, balance sheets, and all board meeting minutes. The management company complied, as required by law, but the documents they provided were a study in strategic obscurity. The budgets were dense spreadsheets filled with vague line items. One entry, in particular, caught his eye: a special assessment for common area landscaping improvements that had been levied 6 months prior, costing each homeowner an extra $500. It was a significant sum, yet Arthur couldn't recall seeing any dramatic improvements to the neighborhood's landscaping. The meeting minutes were even more telling. The minutes for the June board meeting, where this special assessment was supposedly approved, had a large, black rectangle censoring a full paragraph. The text around the redaction was innocuous, but the black box covered the vote and the details of something called landscaping contract, number 2023B. It was a blatant cover-up, the kind of clumsy redaction he'd seen countless times in fraudulent insurance claims. It was an arrow pointing directly to what they were trying to hide. His next step was to investigate Carol Peterson herself. He wasn't looking for personal dirt. He was looking for connections, for motive. He spent an afternoon in the digital archives of the county clerk's office and on public records databases, tracing her history. She wasn't a vengeful victim of a prior HOA, as the old story suggested. She was a licensed real estate agent who had let her license lapse 2 years ago. More interestingly, her property records showed a series of transactions that raised a professional flag. She had purchased her Sunset Ridge home with an unusually small down payment, financed through a private lender, not a conventional bank. The lender was a Shell LLC. A few more hours of digging, cross-referencing corporate filings with political campaign donations, finally gave him a name: Viridian Development Corp. They were a major regional player, known for buying up rural tracts and converting them into high-density subdivisions. A quick search of Viridian's recent projects brought up a news article about a proposed luxury development called Crestview Estates, slated for the land directly north of Sunset Ridge and directly behind Arthur's property. For Crestview to have the premium hill country views their marketing promised, they would need an unobstructed line of sight. A line of sight that ran directly through the 20-foot strip of land where his grandfather's old irrigation shed now stood. The pieces were clicking into place. This wasn't just Carol on a power trip. This was corporate. She was the tip of the spear for a developer. The view corridor wasn't for the benefit of the Sunset Ridge homeowners. It was for the future homeowners of Crestview Estates. One morning, needing a break from the screen, Arthur drove into town for coffee. As he sat by the window of a local cafe, He saw Carol Peterson pull into the parking lot. She was on her phone, and her face, for the first time, was not a mask of placid control. It was etched with stress. She paced back and forth by her car, her voice sharp and anxious. Arthur couldn't hear the words, but the tone was universal, the sound of someone under immense pressure. She rubbed her temples, looking not like a tyrant, but like a weary soldier taking a call from a demanding general. It didn't excuse her actions, but it humanized her motive. This wasn't just a game for her. It was a high-stakes job, and the pressure was coming from above. He returned home and called George Riley, the retired county surveyor who'd helped him on a complex land fraud case years ago. George was old school, a man who trusted paper maps over satellite images and believed the truth was always buried in the archives. "George, it's Arthur Evans. I have a boundary issue that's turned into something else. I need you to do a full title search and a physical survey of my north boundary. But I need you to look for something specific. I need to know everything there is to know about any easement, recorded or otherwise, that benefits Viridian development." Viridian George's voice crackled over the line. "You're swimming with sharks. Arthur, be careful." "The sharks are already in my pasture." "George," Arthur replied, "I just need you to tell me how they got there." 2 weeks later, George Riley stood on Arthur's property line, his tripod-mounted theodolite aimed at a distant survey marker. He was a man in his element, his face tanned and creased from decades spent under the Texas sun. Arthur watched as he made his precise calculations, the quiet clicks of his equipment a counterpoint to the chirping of crickets in the tall grass. "Well, the first part's easy," George said, finally looking up from the eyepiece. "Your shed is 12.5 feet on your side of the line. Clear as day. The HOA's claim of encroachment is pure fiction." Arthur nodded. "I knew that much. What else did you find?" George wiped his brow with the back of his hand and gestured toward his truck. "Let's sit in the air conditioning. What I found is interesting." Inside the cab of George's dusty pickup, surrounded by rolled-up maps and surveying tools, the old surveyor laid out a stack of documents on the dashboard. "I did what you asked. Pulled every deed, every plat, every filing connected to this parcel, going back to the original land grant in 1892. He tapped a thick, yellowed document. "This is the one that matters. The deed from when the original ranch was subdivided in 1965. This is where the utility easement was created." He then produced a much newer document. Now, here's where it gets dirty. When Viridian bought the land for the Sunset Ridge development, they commissioned their own survey, and, in their filings, there interpreted that old utility easement. They filed a declaration with the county, not a formal plat change. Mind you, just a supplementary declaration that referenced the original easement, but added some new language. He pointed to a line of dense text. "See this? Said easement, to also serve as a view corridor in perpetuity for the benefit of adjacent and future developments." It's legally dubious as hell. They're piggybacking on a legitimate utility right-of-way to invent a new restriction out of thin air. "That's what Carol is hanging her hat on," Arthur said, the scheme becoming clearer. "That's not the half of it," George said, a grim smile on his face. He passed another file to Arthur. It contained corporate filings for a consulting company Arthur had never heard of, Peterson Strategic Solutions, LLC. The sole proprietor was Carol Peterson. The company had been formed 6 months ago. "I got curious," George explained. "So I called a friend over in the city planning office. Viridian is in the final stages of getting their permits for the Crestview project. As part of their community impact statement, they have to list their local consultants." He tapped the last document in the file. It was a copy of Viridian's contractor list. under Community and HOA Liaison. It listed Peterson's strategic solutions. The contract was for a consulting fee of $50,000, payable upon the final approval of the Crestview plat. A $50,000 kickback. The redacted minutes, the special assessment, the pressure campaign, it all snapped into focus. The landscaping improvements were likely a sham, a way to launder money, or perhaps pay for the lawyers to harass him. The redaction in the June minutes wasn't just hiding the contract, it was hiding Carol's blatant, disqualifying conflict of interest. She wasn't just a real estate agent working for a developer, she was an active, paid consultant, using her position as HOA president to clear the path for their new development. One fabricated violation at a time. And Arthur's ranch, with his grandfather's shed, was the final, stubborn obstacle. "This is fraud," Arthur said, the words coming out as a quiet statement of fact. "Wire fraud. Likely conspiracy." "It's a hornet's nest." George agreed. "And you just kicked it. That notice of fine is going to be the least of your worries now. They know you're digging. They're going to push back, hard." George's prediction proved prophetic. The first letter arrived a week later. It was from the HOA's lawyers. A formal notice of fine and intent to lien. The initial $100 penalty had already ballooned to $475, with the addition of daily fines and administrative fees. The letter stated that if the full amount was not paid, and the violation not cured within 30 days, the association would file a lien against his property with the Millfield County Clerk. A lien was the HOA's nuclear option. It was a legal claim against his property title that would have to be settled before he could ever sell or refinance. It was a black mark, a permanent stain on the record of the land his family had held for 3 generations. The financial amount was trivial, but the principle was monumental. Paying it would be an admission of guilt, a validation of their fraudulent claim. Not paying it would invite a legal battle that could cost tens of thousands of dollars. The second letter arrived 2 days after the first. It was from his homeowner's insurance company. Re-notice of potential non-renewal of policy. Dear Mr. Evans, we have been notified of an ongoing property dispute and an unresolved covenant violation associated with your property at 1414 Old Mill Road. Please be advised that unresolved disputes involving potential legal liability or structural non-compliance may affect your eligibility for coverage. Please provide documentation showing resolution of this matter within 60 days to avoid non-renewal of your policy at the end of its current term. Arthur stared at the letter. He knew exactly how this had happened. Someone from the HOA, Carol, most likely had filed a formal complaint with his insurer. It was a classic hardball tactic he'd seen in his professional life, designed to weaponize a victim's own financial infrastructure against them. Without homeowner's insurance, his mortgage would be in default. The phone call came that afternoon. It was from a vice president at his bank, a man with a smooth, professional voice that did little to soften the message. "Mr. Evans, we've been alerted by the Sunset Ridge HOA of their intent to file a lien on your property. I'm sure it's just a misunderstanding, but I have to inform you that a senior lien of this nature would constitute a technical default on the terms of your mortgage agreement. We need you to resolve this matter expediently." The pressure was now coming from 3 different directions: the HOA, his insurer, and his bank. It was a coordinated, 3-pronged attack designed to overwhelm and crush him. They were cutting off his financial lifelines, turning the very institutions meant to protect him into instruments of their campaign. Eleanor found him in his study that evening, staring at the pile of letters on his desk. "Arthur," she said, her voice laced with worry, "this is getting out of hand. Maybe we should just pay the fine. Move the shed. It's not worth losing the house over." He looked at her, seeing the genuine fear in her eyes. They were trying to make him feel isolated, trapped. And it was working. For a moment. He considered it. The easy way out. Just give in, and the pressure would vanish. But then, he thought of his grandfather's words, and he looked at the evidence pinned to his corkboard, the doctored maps, the redacted minutes, the proof of Carol's kickback. Giving in wouldn't just be surrendering a piece of his land. It would be complicity in their fraud. It would be letting the lie win. "No," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "They're trying to break us. That's how these things work. They apply pressure until you crack. But they've shown their whole hand. Now, it's my turn to play mine." He looked at the calendar on his wall. The HOA annual homeowners meeting was in 2 weeks. It was a public forum, an audience, and a clock. The Sunset Ridge annual homeowners meeting was the social event of the season. If your season was defined by budget approvals and board elections, the clubhouse was packed with over 100 residents, a sea of polo shirts and khaki shorts. A large screen at the front of the room displayed the meeting agenda, and, next to it, a digital timer, currently set to 5:00. This was for the open forum, the brief window where any homeowner could address the board. Arthur had registered to speak a week in advance. He was listed as speaker number 4. He sat in the back row with Eleanor, his briefcase resting at his feet. Inside was a laptop and a USB drive containing his meticulously prepared presentation. He watched as Carol Peterson ran the meeting with practiced efficiency, moving through the agenda items with a brisk, no-nonsense air. She was confident, poised, in complete control of her domain. Finally, she announced, "We will now move to the open forum portion of our meeting. Each speaker will have 5 minutes. The time will be strictly enforced. First up is Mrs. Gable to discuss the holiday decoration policy." Arthur listened as the first 3 speakers aired their grievances about sprinkler systems, parking violations, and the aforementioned holiday decorations. The timer was ruthless, cutting people off mid-sentence with a jarring electronic beep. Then, Carol's voice rang out. "Next, we have Arthur Evans." He walked to the lectern. The room quiet now. All eyes were on him. He was known as the stubborn rancher who was in a fight with the board. He placed his laptop on the lectern and connected it to the projector. "Good evening," he began, his voice calm and steady. "My name is Arthur Evans. My property borders your community. I'm here tonight to discuss the matter of the lien placed on my property and the so-called view corridor violation." Carol shifted in her chair. "Mr. Evans, this is not the appropriate venue for personal compliance issues. This is a matter for the board and its legal counsel." "On the contrary," Arthur said, clicking the first slide onto the screen. "This matter affects every one of you. It's about how your association is being managed and how your money is being spent." On the screen, 2 maps appeared side by side. One was the official, recorded Millfield County Plat map. The other was the HOA's community map. On the left is a legal document. On the right is a drawing. The board is using this drawing to claim a right to my land that simply does not exist. This is the basis of their fraudulent claim. A murmur went through the crowd. The timer on the screen read 3:45. "This fraudulent claim is not for your benefit," he continued. Clicking to the next slide, it showed an aerial photograph of his property, with the proposed Crestview Estates development superimposed behind it. A bright red line cut across his land. It is for the benefit of Viridian Development and their new Crestview project. Carol stood up. "Mr. Evans, your time is running out, and this is baseless speculation. You are out of order." "I'm not speculating," Arthur said, his eyes locking with hers. He clicked to the next slide. It was the original easement deed from 1965. He had highlighted the key phrase for the installation and maintenance of public utilities. The original easement, the one they are twisting to their purpose, was for utility lines. It has nothing to do with views. The timer showed 1:30. The room was utterly silent. Now, why would the board pursue such a flimsy, legally dubious claim against a private property owner? A claim that has surely cost this association thousands of dollars in legal fees, your money. He paused, letting the question hang in the air. Perhaps this has something to do with it. He clicked to the final, damning slide. It was a copy of the June meeting minutes, but his copy was not redacted. The black box was gone, revealing the text beneath. Motion to approve landscaping contract 2023-B with Viridian Development for common area beautification, and to approve a one-time consulting fee of $50,000 to Peterson Strategic Solutions, LLC for community liaison services related to the Crestview project. Motion carried. Gasps rippled through the audience. People were turning to their neighbors, whispering. Frank Miller, the treasurer, went pale and seemed to shrink in his chair. Carol's face was a mask of fury. That document is a fabrication. Where did you get that? This was the moment. He could name Mrs. Chen, the elderly board member who had slipped him the unredacted copy. Terrified of retaliation, but more terrified of the fraud she was witnessing. He could see her in the third row, her hands clenched in her lap, her face ashen. Exposing her would guarantee his victory, but destroy her peace. He had to find another way. He looked not at Carol, but at Frank Miller. I see the association's treasurer, Mr. Miller, is present, Arthur said, his voice resonating with authority. Mr. Miller, I invite you to produce the official, unredacted copy of the June minutes from the association's records. I invite you to come to this lectern, under the watchful eyes of every homeowner here, and certify, under penalty of perjury, that my copy is a fabrication. Let's see if the board's version of the truth matches the actual document. He turned the tables. He protected his source while trapping the board. Frank Miller looked from Arthur to Carol, his face slick with sweat. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He just shook his head, looking down at the table in defeat. The timer beeped, signaling the end of Arthur's 5 minutes. But no one heard it over the eruption of voices from the audience. The climax wasn't a shout. It was the devastating, irrefutable presentation of the truth. The stunned silence that followed Arthur's challenge lasted only a moment before the room erupted into chaos. Homeowners were on their feet, shouting questions at the board table. A consulting fee. Is this why we had that special assessment? What is going on? Carol Peterson banged her gavel, but the sound was lost in the tumult. Order. This meeting is not. Her voice was drowned out. It was David Chen, Mrs. Chen's son, and a quiet, unassuming lawyer who served on the board, who brought order back to the room. He stood up and spoke in a clear, authoritative voice that cut through the noise. Everyone, please, please, let's handle this properly. The shouting subsided, all eyes turning to him. He was not looking at Carol. He was addressing the homeowners. In light of the evidence presented by Mr. Evans, David said, his voice ringing with conviction, evidence which the treasurer has not refuted, I believe this board has an immediate duty to act. Therefore, I move for the following: first, that the board immediately freeze all enforcement actions and withdraw the lien against Mr. Evans's property. Second, that we vote on a motion of no confidence and censure against President Peterson for a clear and undisclosed conflict of interest. And third, that we commission a full independent forensic audit of this association's finances for the past 2 years. A homeowner in the front row immediately shouted, "I second that motion." The representative from the management company, who had been frozen in place, finally sprang into action. She saw the immense legal exposure, the potential for a class action lawsuit from the homeowners. Her company's survival depended on distancing themselves from the board's corruption. She leaned over and whispered urgently into the ear of the board secretary. Carol, looking cornered and betrayed, tried to regain control. "This is out of order. There is no such motion on the agenda. I believe a motion from a board member, seconded by a homeowner, regarding a potential breach of fiduciary duty, is very much in order." David Chen countered coolly, "We can vote on it right now." The management company rep nodded vigorously. The homeowners roared their approval. The vote was a landslide. Carol Peterson sat in stunned silence as her power evaporated in less than 60 seconds. The motion passed, and she was stripped of her authority on the spot. Frank Miller resigned as treasurer via a hastily scribbled note he passed to the secretary before scurrying out of the room. The meeting was adjourned amidst a buzz of shock and furious energy. In the aftermath, as residents gathered in small, agitated groups, Mrs. Chen approached Arthur, her son David at her side. Her eyes were filled with tears, but they were tears of relief. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You protected me. You did it the right way." Arthur simply nodded. "You were the brave one. Mrs. Chen, you brought the truth to light." The following week was a whirlwind. The management company, in full damage control mode, fully cooperated. The lien on Arthur's property was formally withdrawn. An emergency election was called. Part 10. The Resolution and Final Surprise. A new board was elected, with David Chen as its reluctant but respected president. Their first act was to formally apologize to Arthur and expunge the violation from his record. They asked him if he would consider taking a permanent seat on the board. He politely declined. "I'm a better investigator than I am a politician," he told David with a smile. But he did agree to serve on a temporary oversight committee to help the new board draft a comprehensive ethics and transparency policy, ensuring a conflict of interest like Carol's could never happen again. The forensic audit he had called for began immediately. It was conducted by an outside firm, and Arthur, with his professional background, was asked to help guide their investigation. What they uncovered was even worse than he had suspected. This was the final surprise. The audit revealed that Viridian Development hadn't just corrupted the HOA's president, they had systematically swindled the association itself. The common area landscaping improvements, from landscaping contract during 2023B, were a complete sham. Viridian had billed the HOA nearly $100,000 for premium landscaping work that was either never performed or was done with substandard materials by a low-bid subcontractor. They had used the HOA's own money, funneled through the special assessment, to help finance the very scheme that was defrauding them. Carol Peterson, facing potential civil and criminal charges, had been a pawn in a much larger game. She had been a tool for Viridian, not only to clear an easement, but also to fleece the entire community she was supposed to be protecting. Armed with the audit's irrefutable evidence, Arthur helped the new, transparent board prepare a robust civil suit against Viridian Development. They sued for fraud, breach of contract, and civil conspiracy, faced with a mountain of documentation. Viridian settled out of court for a significant sum far more than they had stolen. The recovered funds, along with the money from the settlement, were placed into a newly created Community Improvement Fund. The first project, approved by a unanimous vote of the homeowners, was to build a new playground on a neglected patch of common area. One crisp autumn evening, months later, Arthur stood on his back porch, a mug of coffee in his hands. The old irrigation shed stood exactly where it always had, a silent monument to the fight. In the distance, he could hear the faint, happy sounds of children playing in the new park. He had wanted peace, and in the end, he had found it, not by avoiding the conflict, but by seeing it through to its just conclusion. He had honored his grandfather's wish. He hadn't let them chip away at his place. Instead, he had helped his neighbors build something better on theirs.